Rank the albums.
I think Ash are the first band I was properly, thoroughly into and gathered the discography of. And they suit that role very well because, they are quite teenage in a vibe and in how old they literally were to begin with. And it's just often brilliant songcraft. You can appreciate them for their singles, of which there are loads that are really good. And then if you're ready, you can discover the albums too, and they are strong also in that regard. They started out with Trailer, which, you can say it's not exactly an album. It was originally published with, 7 tracks. There's a version with some extra tracks piled on the end, but to call it an album, it's called Trailer. They knew what they were doing. That was the whole point. They were still at school and didn't quite have time to concentrate on creating a masterwork. You can see the juvenilia in this. There's 2 sides to it. There's the masterful pop songcraft, although his voice isn't yet confident with it. But there's a charm to that naivety. And the other side of it, which hasn't aged quite as well, is just the Nirvana copyists that every teenage band is, and especially was in 1994. It's still a reasonable listen, but it's kind of just singles and some B-sides, and I can't really advocate anything but the A-sides on it. Proper debut albums called 1977, and there's kind of the same split going on here. You can see the properly brilliant singles, and then a couple more tracks that are that you'd file that way but weren't released as singles. And then there's some more naive ones that they clearly wrote in studio that don't have as much to them. It's still a strong, satisfying listen in total. The 5 singles and the first track and the last track and a couple more along the way. That really puts it above the horizon of good to great albums. I would say stop it before the bonus tracks, although if you look for the pre-gap bonus tracks, that's a nice addition. They're not essential. Obviously, that's going above the trailer, but the trailer's still a decent listen, but this is where we're getting into properly, relevant, great stuff. I don't much believe in the sophomore slump idea, but hi Ash, Nuclear Sounds is quite definitively a difficult second album, and somewhat intentionally, you can kind of hear them maybe not quite trying to alienate their original audience, but at least trying to dissociate from the simple idea of Ash. This is writing with writer's block, and yet it's a properly relevant product within that vibe. They added Charlotte on guitar and backing vocals, and though she rejuvenates that part of the sound, it is the sound of a very exhausted band. But it's so intentionally that, and somewhat artistically that it still checks out. I can't put it above 1977, but it's going in the middle of these. Here's an absolute masterpiece. It's called Free All Angels, and it's just chock full of amazing singles. I could count up the number of these that were released as singles, but the point is, even the ones that weren't sound like they deserve it. The band have absolutely found their strength, and they found their strength as a 4-piece, which is stronger than their initial strength. And they've found their strength after intentionally meandering, which really enunciates that strength. This is obviously at the top so far. There's just so much creative energy to it in a very accessible format. Here's a compilation CD that doesn't really matter, but Ash may well be one of those bands where it's worth hearing the compilation CD. The Lucy tracks on here are worth having. I'm not actually going to put this in the ranking, but I'm going to say that there's a version of Intergalactic Sonic 7 Inches that comes with a second CD, and that's got loads of B-sides on it, and surprisingly, Ash are also a really good B-sides band. They have the material to offer. Both discs of this are quite long and still very fun and pop-oriented, and there's 4 or 5 tracks on the B-sides disc that could easily have been hit singles. The B-sides bit can go here on its own merits, it's that good. Next is Meltdown, and it's still the band firing on all cylinders. Well, I guess the absolute genius Songcraft cylinder has been dialed back a little bit to emphasize the rocking out Cylinder. It's powerful, the singles are great, it's comparatively a little more disposable in the long run, but it's worth it when it's on. It might lose a couple of points for this horrible plastic case I got it in, but I'm not absolutely certain at this ranking, but I'm going to put it a smidge above 1977. It's better than that in some ways, and not quite as good in other ways. Growing up with Ash, the next one was called Twilight of the Innocents, and Charlotte was no longer in the band. I didn't like the sound of the singles. They were a bit obnoxious. It kind of felt like their creativity was running dry. It felt as awkward as that cover photo. Personally, I lost touch with them for a while, but I checked this out years later, and I think a lot of the obnoxiousness is earned. You know, You Can't Have It All really hammers that through in a way that eventually wins me over. Elsewhere on the album, there's some nice retro songwriting. Shadows and Dark and Stormy, Blacklisted, maybe End of the World, sound a bit more traditional, more like 60s, 70s pop rock, in a way that Ash hadn't yet properly tapped into, and they've earned it here. The final track is an absolute epic, but it's a patchier work. I think it's kind of underappreciated, but just by a couple of notches. I would rank this very close to Nuclear Sounds, and today I'm putting it above, but I may have to apologize to my tomorrow self. There's something a little awkward about Twilight's that it kind of feels like exactly what it was, which was that time in rock music when all the bands were being talked into trying to make really big singles, as if rock songs can still chart among pop songs. But Ash naturally do that, and this one just felt more artificial. I think Ash were aware of that at the time, and they saw the album format dying out, and thereby to kind of refresh themselves, they went on a project of releasing 26 singles within a year, one every fortnight. But the thing is, I collect albums, so they eventually compiled these into a couple of CDs, with 13 of the tracks on each of them and some extra stuff. Mentally, I have to kind of file them separately, even though as a creative project, there was an obvious continuous thing going on here. The first half of it shows the creative powerhouse of Ash still making great songs every couple of weeks. There's like 10 or so tracks of this that are really worth it. I think as the project went on, you can see the exhaustion set in a bit and kind of the ideas get less fresh, although the musicianship strengthened along the way. The second half of A to Z isn't as good a listen, but here's where they're going in the pile. First half, just below 1977. Second half is going to go near the bottom, the lowest full length on here thus far. But I don't mean it as an insult. Ash's next work was called Kablamo. Yeah, you see what they're doing there, it's aesthetically about immediacy. I think it's not quite as honestly vivacious as they used to be, but it's still a worthwhile listen, but with kind of fewer superlative strengths. It's going down here. And that brings us to the one I never got a copy of. I'm sorry, Ash, but the album Islands, the most recent one, I don't like the sound as much. They were hinting that way a little bit on Kablamo, but it's now something that I'm not that into. I've given it a few listens all the way through, and they're doing that harsh production that, you can just do good production. And I think the songcraft is lacking. The instrumentation doesn't have many ideas in it. It kind of feels like when someone from a band does a solo album. To my tastes, there's not that much on there. Tim has separately made a solo album. I've listened to it, but I respect its intent to not be considered as part of Ash. It's a personal product, some nice synthy ideas, but an unforgivably repetitive 10-minute track. There's one on there where they seem to think that a 2-chord dirge is fine as long as you put a disco beat on it. Whatever, not for me, and it's a sad way to end this video of ridiculously good guitar pop music full of brilliant harmonies, brilliant guitar solos and melodies, often lovely lyrics on the more romantic side. Occasionally embarrassing sexual lyrics, but I love Ash and they're easy to get into. Give it a try.